This podcast is brought to you by the IIEA, sharing ideas, shaping policy.
Thank you all very much. You're all very welcome. Thanks for joining us. My name is Alex White. I'm Director General here at the Institute of International European Affairs. As you know, our focus this afternoon is on COP29, taking place in Baku, due to finish today. I think from what I'm reading and hearing, unlikely to finish today. I'm not sure if any of them has ever finished on the day that they were supposed to finish on, but the important point is to get agreement, of course, and that tends to run into the weekend at the end of these fortnight-long meetings. So we'll see how it works out over the weekend. Obviously, among the key priorities of COP29 is securing a new goal on climate finance and ensuring that every country has the means to take the sort of, stronger and robust climate action that's required, slashing greenhouse gas emissions and building resilient communities. Also in focus is the next round of national climate plans, or NDCs, currently being developed by countries ahead of next year's deadline. And I think all COPs are important, but there's a sort of a consensus there that the next COP30 in Brazil is going to be a critically important one. But each one is important in its own way. As somebody was just saying earlier, sometimes there's high expectations that are not necessarily met, but very good work can be done. Really good groundwork can be laid at a particular COP that doesn't look at a distance to be great, but amazing amount of work. A bit like work in government, things can happen slowly over years and not necessarily be recognized when it's happening, but then can come to fruition later on. So we have an excellent panel this afternoon. And we're going to talk about this COP and what's being achieved and what might be achieved there, what's happening today. And in addition, I think we'll take some time to reflect on, the whole kind of usefulness and sustainability, perhaps, of the COP process itself. And we've had some discussion on this in the Institute here over the last year or so, whether these annual meetings are the best way to proceed and whether there might be other ways. Some of our guest speakers have spoken about regional conferences and regional initiatives perhaps being something that should be looked at. But in any event, this is the system we have, and I think probably the international community and the UN would be slow to abandon it unless there's clarity about what it will be replaced by. So it's all very well to say that it has drawbacks, but what are you going to do that is going to bring the same kind of attention at such a high level every year, in November, December, every year, right across the whole world? And that's a critical achievement of the COP process, it seems to me, even if some of the meetings are less than successful than others. So we have, as I said, as we always say, a stellar lineup, a terrific panel with us this afternoon. I want to thank, first of all, SSE for their kind support and cooperation and collaboration on this event. Very much welcomed. And Sam Peacock is the Managing Director of Corporate Services, Regulatory and Strategy at SSE. And Sam is joining us here on the panel. He's been a member of the SSE Group Executive Committee since 2020 and leads the company's teams overseeing corporate strategy, government and regulatory affairs, communications, brand and local project communications. Before joining SSE, he directed government affairs at the UK regulator Ofgem and worked at leading communications agency Edelman, as well as in the UK Parliament and in the UK government. I'm going to introduce each of the panelists together now at the start, rather than actually giving their bios again when I come to invite them to speak, if that's okay. Erin Marr is lead sustainability strategist and advisor at ENSO. ENSO is a certified B corporation that helps SMEs with ESG strategy and regulatory preparedness. She holds a BSc from University of Michigan in climate science and impacts engineering with a focus on climate adaptation, and an MSc in development practice from Trinity College Dublin. Jerry McEvely, right here beside me, is Head of Policy in Friends of the Earth, where he manages research, advocacy and stakeholder engagement in support of campaigns on fossil fuel phase-out and climate action. Jerry has over 15 years' experience in developing, researching and influencing policy in both the government and not-for-profit sectors. Previously, he had policy positions in the Oireachtas, the Department of Foreign Affairs, CRU, as well as a number of NGOs. He's a member of the NESC, the EPA Advisory Committee, and AirGrid's National Advisory Committee. So you can see super panel. But last but absolutely not least is our speaker joining us from Baku. I'm not sure if Sinead is standing by as yet. I think she is. Sinead Walsh is a critically important figure in what Ireland is doing, and indeed what through Ireland and through the work that Eamon Ryan is doing, is achieving in Baku. Also met her in Dubai last year, and she's probably, we don't like to particularly embrace the term veteran sometimes when it's said about us. It makes us sound a bit old, but I think I'm going to say that Sinead is a veteran in a really good way of this process. Is such an important figure. She's climate director in the Department of Foreign Affairs. Prior to that, she served as EU ambassador to South Sudan. Dr. Sinead Walsh has worked for Ireland's DFA, Department of Foreign Affairs, since 2009. She was previously ambassador to Sierra Leone and Liberia, and was the head of Irish aid in those two countries. Before joining DFA, Sinead spent 10 years working in the NGO sector and is the co-author of Getting to Zero, a doctor and a diplomat on the Ebola frontline. So Sinead, everybody's welcome, but you are particularly welcome, because I can only imagine the pressures there, and the toing and froing and effort to achieve agreement, drafting words, new words, old words being thrown out, everything that needs to be done. How's it going there, Sinead? And over to you. Delighted to have you.
Hi, folks, and thanks, Alex, and hi to everybody there. I'd love to be there in person, because that would mean that I was no longer here, but I'm still here. I don't expect to be leaving all that soon. I think, look, we really have never any idea when a COP is going to end, but let's just say I wouldn't be confident that it will end today. I think it will definitely end by tomorrow at midnight, just because the same thing ends up happening at every negotiation, where you find out that a whole pile of people have flights at a certain time, and you just know that you'll lose a quorum. So I think my calculation, that's midnight tomorrow, and we would start losing a quorum with people going to the airport for very long flights with loads of connections. So that would be my best guess at the moment, if I had to put money on it. But I think things are definitely progressing, and they are getting better. So the status is that we got the second draft of the texts about an hour and a half ago, maybe. So we're still analyzing them. So actually, Minister Ryan is in the EU coordination with the other EU ministers at the moment, and I just jumped out to talk to you guys, and we'll jump back in again. But essentially, the second draft of text, I think, is definitely better. And so I think we're getting closer to where we need to be. But I think our expectation is what the presidency has said is that there will be a further draft. So the process now will be, the groups will be giving feedback to the presidency on the current draft. But I think we're seeing progress. The big issue for this COP, as I think everybody knows, is to agree a new climate finance goal. It has a very unfortunate acronym of the NCQG. And so that, I think, is where all or most eyes are focused on this COP. There's a couple of other really important issues which I'll mention in a minute as well. But I think this is definitely the headline. This draft, for the first time, because yesterday's draft didn't have it, it has a number. For the public core, for the finance that should be provided by, by developed countries to developing countries. So essentially, there is a kind of a bigger number, which is kind of what all sources of finance should add up to, and that's 1.3 trillion. And we had that in the draft from yesterday, but today's draft for the first time has the public core, and that's 250 billion. And some of you may be following this. Certainly people like Jerry would be following this very closely over the years. This climate finance goal is the follow-up to the previous one, and the previous one was 100 billion a year from essentially developed countries to developing countries for climate finance. So we're talking from 100 to 250. But as you will probably be seeing from the media, there's a lot of people, in the developing countryside who are already saying this is not enough, and who are calling for higher numbers. So it's going to be a long night, and it's going to be a long day. It'll probably just be like one big long day today, which will last through tomorrow, as is often the case at the end of COP. But we are currently in the EU kind of looking at, obviously, not just that number, but all the other aspects of what's in the finance text, and also looking at the other texts. The only text that we haven't seen is Article 6, and that is a really important issue for this COP. So I'll just briefly mention that as well. That's basically the rules around governing carbon markets. So the concept would be, you're the government of the Republic of Congo, you have forests, you need help to protect, you need sort of finance to help to protect them and maintain them, and you may want to do a deal with either with a country or with a company to buy, kind of carbon credits that you can use, and you sort of guarantee to protect the forest, and then you get some finance that might help you to do that. So that's the kind of basic concept. It sort of happens already, but it's not very regulated at the moment. So Article 6 is this kind of long-standing negotiation to try to regulate that, and the EU is kind of very strong in that negotiation, trying to make sure that we have good rules, good integrity, good governance around those rules. That's the only text that hasn't come out yet, so we're kind of expecting that any minute, and that will kind of complete our overall text. There are definitely some things that we're worried about. I mean, there's always things that we're not going to be happy about, and every group is the same, so that's kind of fair enough. But mitigation has definitely strengthened from yesterday to today, but there's still some things that we'd prefer if it was in there. We're quite worried, I think, about gender and human rights. I think overall that has gotten worse, actually, and many of you will probably know that gender and human rights has been undergoing a kind of a pushback in a lot of multilateral fora. So I think that's really important as well. So there's, as many of you will know, Alex, you'll certainly know very well, in some ways the COP is its own thing, but it's also very much interconnected with, the UN General Assembly or the Commission of the Status of the Women, in New York, and all sorts of fora. So conceding something here on something like gender and human rights could actually have a wider implication, I suppose, in the global system is the point. But generally, I think we are making progress. We are talking to each other. Some countries like, China, for example, have been really quite constructive in this COP. Some other parties who I won't name, but you know who they are, have been very unconstructive, but they're always unconstructive. But I do think we're getting there, and the texts, on the whole, are better than they were yesterday. But I would imagine there'll be one more draft. Maybe just one last word around kind of Ireland's kind of top priority at this COP, which is on adaptation. So Minister Ryan has been the ministerial pair, so presidencies of the COP, so in this case, obviously Azerbaijan, they nominate ministerial pairs to kind of help them, get texts over the line. And so there's one minister from a developed and one minister from a developing country. So that's been Ireland and Costa Rica on adaptation. And that's been quite a good process, really quite a constructive process. It's not one of the sort of hot button issues of the COP. There are some controversies within there that we've been trying to manage, but it's not as difficult as the NCQG, the finance goal. And we've really been quite we've had a great partnership with Costa Rica, but also we found really kind of constructive parties in the room that want to move forward on adaptation. But also we've been pushing very hard. Because as people may know, Ireland, we spend 80% of our climate finance on adaptation. It's one of our top priorities for diplomacy as well. So we've also been pushing very hard to try and get adaptation finance a proper, concrete reference within the finance text, not just in the adaptation text, but actually in the finance text, to look at sort of concrete measures on how we increase adaptation finance. So I would say those are a couple of the big issues for us. Alex, as I think I don't have long, so I don't know if it suits. I'm happy to take questions.
Yeah, but that's what we were going to do in ease of you and being aware that you're in the center of things there, maybe called away at any minute, and you're so good to give us some time. Absolutely, what we'll do is before we go to the other speakers, and they don't mind either, are there any questions that anybody has, including perhaps the other speakers, but anybody here? Also, there are people online, of course, watching. I didn't do the housekeeping at the start. If you're online, you can put a question in. I don't see any at the moment, so I'll concentrate on the people in the room here. Some questions, if there are any, for Sinead before she has to go back to the really important work that she's doing. We won't delay you too long, Sinead, I promise. So, anybody like to pose any question? Yeah, Barry.
Thanks very much, Sinead. It's Barry Colfer here from the IIEA. Thanks so much for being available. Can you just say anything, generally speaking, about the mood there compared to previous COPs?
Yeah, it's a good question. I wouldn't say, look, I'd say it's a bit mixed. I mean, obviously the election of Donald Trump, given that the last time he was elected, he pulled the US out of the Paris Agreement, wasn't a great kind of baseline, maybe, to, something that happened literally earlier this month. But at the same time, we're kind of seeing a bit what we saw the last time he was elected in 2016, which is that there's a kind of a rallying of other people. And I wonder whether the kind of constructive, positive engagement that we've seen from China might also relate to that. Clearly, I have no idea, but I do think that has been noteworthy, and also you've got great solidarity within the EU room, and really people pushing mitigation also, that we have to build on what we got in Dubai last year on mitigation. We can't kind of forget about that, and Alex mentioned the national mitigation plans that are due in Brazil, and how this COP is supposed to give signals for that. So there's a really strong push for everybody that we kind of have to double down. So the mood is kind of mixed in a way. I mean, the finance goal was always going to be incredibly difficult. And it is incredibly difficult. And as I said, we're not finished. But I think the mood today is better than yesterday, because I think on the whole, the texts have improved. Like I say, some of them have disapproved, like gender and human rights references. But I would say on the whole, they've improved. So, I think the mood is getting better. But it's such a critical point that and I think Ireland, we have a real ability to do this, and we're trying to do this. We need to be showing solidarity and empathy with the developing countries, particularly the least developed countries and the small island states that Ireland focuses on a lot, who are suffering horrendous impacts and who mitigate almost nothing. And who are understandably very angry. And then, when you talk about finance, it's obviously extremely tense and all of that. And many of us, not Ireland, but, there's other European countries that are in very difficult fiscal situations at the moment. So it's a tricky time. And so, yeah, like I say, the mood is kind of mixed. And I suppose we're trying to play our little role in terms of, helping to show that solidarity and that empathy with developing countries, while also trying to sort of say, look, we'll do what we can, but we're not going to be able to sort of come up with astronomical numbers, because it's simply not realistic in given the fiscal situations of a lot of the big countries. So yeah, so it's tricky, but I think it's better than it was yesterday. I think yesterday was quite a difficult day, because there was a lot of unhappiness with the first draft, and today it's a bit better, and hopefully we can come up with something. Look, it's one of those things, if everybody's unhappy, then it's been a successful negotiation. So that's what we're aiming for. We're trying to make everybody equally unhappy, but nobody way more unhappy than everybody else.
Okay, Sam, did you indicate to me, like, and I'm not going to hold you, Sinead, I will let you go after your next response, I promise, unless you have to go right now, in which case we won't be in the least bit.
No, I can take one more, no problem.
3 minutes, yeah. So Sam, and I'm just wondering whether Erin or Jerry, at the same time, have 30 seconds of something that they were going to say that maybe Sinead might respond to. But if you don't, that's okay. 30 seconds, though, is really what we're talking about, or a minute. Thanks very much, Sam. Sam's from SSE.
Hi, you can hear me reasonably clearly, Sinead. You're obviously right in the middle of it at the moment. And mine was more a question, because people were certainly externally talk about the next COP in Brazil as being a kind of bigger one with the NDCs coming, and it was all about getting that enabling finance to help the developing countries kind of go into that. If you're looking at the deal that's in front of you today, do you think that gives us enough energy to get a good COP next year? Does it set us back? Does it kind of set that up well? Just interested in your perspective. I appreciate asking you to project yourself forward when you're probably right in the middle of it, but I was just interested in your perspective.
Yeah. Good context. Yeah, absolutely.
It is a really good question, and I think it just entirely depends on who you ask. It's also like it's far too early for us to know, because we're still negotiating, right? So we don't expect anybody to say that they're happy, right? At this point, everybody's going to say they're outraged and all that kind of thing, and you don't necessarily know how people really feel until it's all kind of done and dusted. Some people genuinely will be outraged, and some people will be saying they're outraged because they're trying to get a better deal. But I think another kind of point of it is it depends very much what kind of a country you are. One of the things that we're saying, we say as Ireland, 84% of Ireland's climate finance goes to the least developed countries and small island states, right? So we're a particular example of we really prioritize the most vulnerable countries, but that's not necessarily the case for a lot of the climate finance. And so I think if you're an LDC or a SID, you really need us to come up with a good public finance number. If you're a middle income country, you might be more interested in the outer layer. So you might be more interested in the investments, with the language that's in what we call the more qualitative language in the finance text, which is more about levels of concessionality, kind of what can we do around debt issues, around de-risking. So like I remember Minister Ryan and I and others were in the Africa Climate Summit last year, which was hosted by Kenya in Nairobi, and they very much were saying, like, we're not looking for your grants, we're looking for your investment. They used a specific term. They said we're looking for fairness, we're not looking for freebies. So they were very much saying we see climate action. Now Kenya is in a particularly good situation with hydropower and so on, but they were saying, we see climate action very much as that we can get lots of engagement of the private sector and so on. So we need the sort of debt situation, the interest rates and so on and so forth to be fair, but we don't need grants. Whereas if you're from kind of Malawi or Sierra Leone and so on, so you're more interested in that inner public core, and you need that to be high enough. And if you're other countries, you might be like, no, look, if we get better terms of trade, then we can manage. So I think we'll have to wait and see how the dust settles, both on that public core and then on those more sort of qualitative elements, which we hope are going to give signals to also other processes like World Trade Organization and so on, because this is often how things happen in our system, that the COP will call for something and then the same countries in an ideal world will try and make some of that stuff more operational in the multilateral development banks with the WTO or so on. So I think we'll have to see how the dust settles. I think if you ask people today, they will say absolutely not, it's outrageous, but we're still in the middle of a negotiation, so you don't really expect the truth. So maybe ask me in a week and I'll have an answer for that.
Well, part of your job is distinguishing between actual outrage and performative outrage, as I gather from what you're saying.
That's it.
Thank you so much, Sinead. We're going to let you go. It's coming up on the half hour. I'm sure the pressure is on there. And just thank you so much for your time that you've given us this afternoon. It's really valuable. And for what you've said, but also for the opportunity to kick off some more discussion here after you've gone. So best of luck with everything.
No worries, Alex. It's a pleasure. And as I've been told that it's being recorded, so I'll watch the rest of you later on, and sorry to have to dash. Thanks a lot.
Excellent. Thanks again. Jerry, I think I'll go to you first. And what we did was we'd invite each of our panelists maybe to give us 4 or 5 minutes just on your sense, both from what you've heard from Sinead, but also generally on your sense and what Friends of the Earth, how you've been viewing this COP, the context of it, where it might lead us.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you very much for having me. So I'm Jerry McKevely. I'm Head of Policy in Friends of the Earth Ireland, and we are an NGO which primarily campaigns and does research and advocacy and education on climate justice issues, particularly on areas related to climate action, fossil fuel phase out, and energy efficiency. And I should start by saying, even trying to focus on any one work stream or action area, COP29, it is such a giant behemoth. I really appreciate Sinead coming out to give her views. And there's just such a risk of oversimplification. And I should say this situation is actually quite representative of being at COP, where a text has just come out and you're very confident that everything you're about to say, or that everything that you had said, is now out of date. So if Friends of the Earth ends up being significantly more critical tomorrow, you'll understand why. But I want to address 3 areas, and they touch upon some of the points that Sinead made around the levels of climate finance and the references to fossil fuels in the text, which broadly speaking, NGOs are not happy with in terms of what's just been released. In terms of climate finance, so the negotiations in this area have an extremely long and complicated history. I'm only going to scratch the surface. I'm also relying heavily on updates from my colleagues at COP. That's why I was looking at my phone, particularly from my colleague Sean, who's there, Sean McLaughlin. But so the new collective quantified goal is the framework under which the negotiation to establish scaled-up climate finance post-2025, replacing the existing annual 100 billion goal. That's what's being discussed. We're in a situation where, as you've heard, trillions, not billions, are needed, particularly through grants. This is very easy for an NGO to throw out, but this is the reality of what climate vulnerable countries are really facing. And there's a situation where not only have inadequate sums been committed to, but it's also often in the forms of loans or not clearly focused on achieving Paris commitments. We also have a situation where pledges for funding irreparable climate impacts, which is called loss and damage, are nowhere near they need to be. And several states and NGOs are calling for a particular sub-goal in that area. And at the same time, there's also an increasing focus on raising levels of public finances through other sources. And this is also where you may have heard, you know, that there's a real focus on sources of finance through the likes of phasing out fossil fuel subsidies and making the polluters pay through levies on fossil fuels, for example, in the area of shipping and aviation. On the negative side, the text that is there at the moment, there is nowhere near the specificity that is needed. And there's a real fear of loopholes that where, for example, phrases are present which simply refer to other sources of finance or including innovative sources of finance, that states do not, there's gaps. And of course, states need up to, this is a key point actually, states need to live up to their existing public finance commitments that have been made. But in terms of this language on innovative sources, there's a particular concern, for example, that carbon markets or carbon credits could be labeled as climate finance. While we can't, you know, at all dismiss the need for states to deliver on their own public climate finance commitments, I personally regard it as a positive that the spotlight is actually on the fossil fuel industry and levies, because that's something that has been too contentious at previous COPs. In terms of, I want to turn briefly to the area of mitigation and fossil fuel phase out. And this is very much linked to the negotiations on both agendas. So it's states and the negotiating blocks when they're there, you know, nothing's agreed until everything's agreed, that they expect progress on both work streams. And progress in this area is also far from guaranteed. And some of this refers back to the commitments that were made at the last COP. You know, you would have heard of commitments around the global stock take and significant increases in renewables and energy efficiency, which is broadly called the UAE consensus, to use the terminology. But the point is that in terms of the text that's there, even getting a repetition of the commitment from COP28 at Baku, the repetition of that language is far from guaranteed, which is really problematic. It was actually taken out of one negotiating work stream last week, which some of you may have seen reports of. And there's a real demand for what many of you would know as climate pledges or nationally determined contributions, or NDCs, that these new climate pledges have to be brought out next year, or enhanced ones, I should say, and that these need to integrate, and this may sound blindingly obvious to some of you, but that these actually need to integrate those commitments around fossil fuel phase out. So when countries come forward with their new plans or pledges, that it integrates language on fossil fuel phase out in terms of production and consumption. And long story short, that is far from guaranteed. Just want to make a few final points on the usefulness of COP, or reflecting on COP, if that's okay. Will I come back to that?
As a kind of a phase in the discussion.
That's absolutely
And
fine.
you know what I mean? But I will come back to it, and I will come back to you. Is that okay? Just to move it for the initial sense from the others, and then we will come back to that theme as we progress. So, Aaron, I gave your introduction earlier. The folks know who you are. You're very welcome to. I know you've been watching this COP closely, and indeed other COPs. I think you've been podcasting and doing commentary.
Yeah.
So what do you reckon? How do you judge it at the moment, and what are your thoughts?
Yeah, thank you so much for the introduction and for having me here with this amazing panel and having this discussion. As you said so eloquently, it's really, really difficult to follow singular work streams at COP. So how I try to look at it and break it down is through kind of 4 key points. I tried to make these 4 A's, but they weren't all A's. So it's the action, accessibility, adaptation, and then kind of who's at the table. That's the one I couldn't get the A for. But so attendance. Yes, there we go. Awesome. So basically for me, I'm looking at those 4 things across any work streams that they're doing, whether it's finance, mitigation, whether it's discussing carbon markets. And the reason I'm looking at it this way is because a big part of what I do and what a lot of us are working towards now is translating what's going on at COP for normal people. What does this mean for us? What does this mean for the businesses we run? What does this mean for Ireland, for Dublin, for our hometowns, whatever that might be? So first, in terms of adaptation, this is something that's always been really, really important to me. My background is in climate adaptation. We have locked in effects of climate change, regardless of if we stopped emitting right this second, there would be impacts. We're seeing them already, even with these like this big cold snap, the way that the polar vortexes are changing, we're seeing that right now. So I always am looking at for progress on that global goal for adaptation and the specific guidance and finance for making that happen. And there hasn't been a whole lot, which was a bit of a disappointment for me. Maybe something miraculously will come out in the next 24 hours. We'll see. But that's something that I'm always looking at and have been kind of disappointed on for the past couple of years. But a lot of non-state actors have come out with more interesting and promising ideas around that adaptation, which I can discuss in more detail later on. Then we've got that accessibility. Who can access the climate finance? How do they get it? Is it tied to anything for them getting that aid? Are they going to be required to buy from a certain person or pay that back in a certain way? Or is it a grant? So looking at how is that broken down? Who has access to it? And how do they get it? Which is something I think is currently missing from the information we have. It's probably in that text that Sinead is looking at as we speak. So seriously, in 10 minutes, we could know more about it. So that's the next thing I look at. Then there's that attendance, and thank you for that 4th A. It's so important who is at the table, who is making these decisions. Is it the most developed countries that are not feeling these huge impacts, or are we giving a centering voice to these small island developing states, to the least developed nations that really probably have the best handle on how climate change is impacting us and will continue to impact us because they are seeing the brunt of it. So we want them at the table. Who is deciding on this text and who's happy and who's not? Or as Sinead put it really nicely, who's the most unhappy? I liked that a lot. I think that's kind of really where we're at with COP. And then, so we've got our attendance, accessibility, and then action is the last one that I haven't talked about yet. COP has always felt to me like for some reason we're treating it as the pinnacle of the climate year, where it should be the beginning of our action year. So I like to see what comes out of COP. What are the tangible goals, which we probably won't know until into next week, when everyone starts to dissect it and decide how we're going to start to mobilize as private actors, public actors, governments, whatever that might be. But for me, I want to boil it down into where are we going and then how do we get there? Because that's the best way we found to communicate it from a higher level to why does it matter for us? So those are my 4 A's to look at through COP.
Really clear. Thank you very much. Sam, SSE, I know that you certainly, because I was there myself last year, very prominent there. I mean, if people who are, I don't know, are familiar with COP, but I mean, it's just a vast city, you know, it's just, there's so much happening. It's an extraordinary phenomenon of a thing just to witness. And companies like SSE will, I think, make big efforts, certainly you did, to insert yourself, not just to be there and be visible, but to insert yourself into the discussion, which I think is admirable and really important, and to lead events and to chair events and to invite. I think last year you hosted the then UK climate minister, as far as I recall, was there, the then head of the Climate Council in the UK. So you're in the debate, as well as saying, look, we're here, here's SSE, look at us, you're in the debate as well. So has that been the case this year, and how do you view this year's COP?
Yeah, and thanks to the IIEA for the session. I mean, your first point's a really interesting one, though, of what you see when you're there. It's quite overawing and humbling, actually, because you see people from all around the world. There's tribes people there. You see there was a kind of yurt in the Mongolian section. There's all sorts of fascinating, interesting things. It was the fourth one I've been to, and I found it very interesting. Just a word on why we go as SSE, then maybe what we saw. COP is a brilliant sort of moment to bring a lot of actors involved in the energy transition in the same place. We find that very useful to have kind of conversations around how you unblock delivery barriers, how you can try and make clean investment happen. So a lot of the time we kind of spend our time, we're investing 40 billion in clean energy over the next decade. So we've in 9 countries. So there's a lot of that international debate we find valuable. We spend quite a lot of time, I suppose, sharing knowledge, offering advice, and trying to show some support for the process. I mean, just to give you one example of some of the strange conversations you get to in COP, I mean, we were sort of this time talking to the Cape Verde Islands about how they could do hydro. We were talking in the past around to Sri Lanka about how you might be able to do offshore wind, because they've got fantastic resource there. And you find that there's a company there, people are interested. I mean, we're putting, if you think about the offshore wind, we're building Dogger Bank, world's largest offshore wind farm, 150 kilometers off the North Sea, and you're basically putting in hundreds of the Eiffel Tower and then hundreds of the London Eye. And people are interested in that because other countries want to make that happen. In terms of what we saw there, it was, to echo Sinead's point, she's obviously closer to the action than we are, but you definitely felt like an in-between COP with a lot of the focus on that finance, kind of gearing up for next year. I suppose there's an overwhelming vibe on the energy transition, that it's happening, but it's not happening quite fast enough. You could really feel that everywhere. I felt some of the US backdrop, we were talking about this a couple of minutes ago, the US backdrop was tricky. You kind of had the Biden team on one side talking about how they've used the IRA to lower the cost of different energy technologies, but you also had the kind of when will they pull out piece. Europe, the European debate was very interesting, a lot about how you decarbonize, but obviously German factories, how do we keep the costs low? There was a lot of that sort of transition discussion in Europe that was interesting. And to Sinead's point, the kind of the sort of global south discussion, we're involved in bits of that. There's much around how you finance it with interest, inflation flying around and all that. I thought, just to comment on Ireland, and Rob was raised it when we caught up earlier, as well when we were discussing with the guys here. I thought Eamon Ryan was very visibly, very leading from the front for Ireland. You could see the kind of work he's been doing as a lead negotiator was extremely powerful. Felt like Ireland was sort of leading on some of the just transition arguments, which we were very, very supportive of. And a general kind of cooperation theme, whether it's things like carbon trading and making sure that that's a kind of, as wide and linked schemes as possible, and other forms of cooperation, I thought was really, really interesting. And then probably just the last main point I'd just make is, you speak to all these different countries, you speak to all these different people who are trying to do energy transition, some of the same themes always come back. How do you get planning faster? How do you make sure the market works? How do you make sure the grid's there? how do you make sure, how do we deal with, talking earlier about how do you deal with Jerry was talking about how to deal with data center demand. And what was really interesting is sometimes we think it's all very, very different and special and unique in our countries, but a lot of those challenges are the same. And when I think about here, you sort of, maybe 4 years ago at COP, everyone's talking about renewables. Finally, 2 years ago, people started talking about grid. And now people are beginning to talk about how that clean flexibility evolves. It's probably a little bit like that in Ireland, some of the debates here. So I'll probably leave it at that because I think we'll talk about the process. But jaw-droppingly interesting.
Yeah.
We find it valuable and we try and contribute something to it.
Just the overall, I'm consciously, Erin and others touched on it, like this, bringing it to the level of, you know, how people feel about what the outcome might be, a sense of optimism or a sense of pessimism, and the mood can kind of rise and fall, including at the actual COP. The mood, you know, Sinead even in her few minutes saying it feels pretty good that we might be making tracks, but it could go all terribly wrong very quickly, and or there could be a terrible protracted period of a really low mood, and then suddenly something happens, somebody cracks or somebody, you know, somebody changes. So, I mean, that seems to be the vibe there right this afternoon, doesn't it? It's like, what was your thing about like who's the least unhappy or who's the most happy? You know, it's like it's if somebody's unhappy, well then maybe the reality is that it's going well. If you look to see who's unhappy, like this is the way the human mind works. You know, like if country square brackets insert the name of the country, if they're unhappy, well then we're probably making progress. Isn't that the way sometimes you have to judge it? Unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, I was actually maybe going to challenge that perspective.
Okay, well, please do.
I mean,
please do.
Because given maybe the state of some of the debates on the climate finance, it's not purely the levels of figures. I know trillions was mentioned, and 250 billion. It's the real fine detail, like legislation or policy around qualitatively how it's provided and in what form. And I guess there would be some at the moment who would be stating that perhaps this may change rapidly, as you just said, Alex, but that no deal would be better than a bad deal. So that is, it's worth, I guess, considering that may equally be an outcome.
Yeah. I mean,
Can I just piggyback off that?
Please,
we were discussing that earlier today, the fact that when I first heard that no deal is something that could theoretically happen, I was like, why would that ever be a better outcome? But I do think moving forward into COP30 and how important it is with the new NDCs and with it being on at the same time as the G20 in the same place, which could be really interesting for moving forward. Yeah, you don't want to move backwards this year. I personally now actually am thankful because Sinead made me feel a little bit better about where it's going because she's right there on the ground, but it could change really rapidly.
Yeah. I mean, on balance, you have to think that there's a higher than a 50% chance that there's an agreement that's going to happen, you know, in some shape or form. It may be one that people find hard to sell, but there's going to be something coming out of it, I'd have thought. But that's just from observing previous. Anybody like to come in? Anybody like to ask a question or make an observation? Yeah, Francis.
Francis Jacobs, where is the leadership coming at the COP? Obviously, many of the prime ministers haven't turned up this time. And I'd like to know, what is the role of the European Union? Sometimes in the past, it's been very strong, other times weaker. China, Sinead said, was being constructive. But what about countries like India? And I won't, obviously, the other thing, of course, is the United States in the pre-Trump era, and to what extent some of the sub-federal actors are playing a role.
Can we take a stab at that?
I can start.
Yeah.
No, I was going to say, I can start off with kind of the pre-Trump era. I came in very prepared for this question because I knew you hear the accent and you're going to want to talk about it. I'm operating on the assumption we will pull out again, the United States, because it's just better to think that way, and maybe we get lucky and he forgets about it with all the rest of the craziness. But yeah, so I think the kind of regional and state by state actors, even this year, are way more important for the United States than they have been in the past, because they are going to be a little bit more, there's going to be a little bit less turbulence there because we have some continuity in governance in most of the country. the gubernatorial races aren't usually the same year as the presidential race, so it gives a little bit of continuity there. However, I think that our strength as a country is lacking because someone like the EU comes in with so much knowledge, so many resources, so many people and different countries that have this experience and the solutions and the knowledge to share, just like you were talking about. And we lose a lot of that when we don't bring the entire country to the table. And I'm sad about that, but hopeful actors like New England, like the Great Lakes states will really make a difference. And because we get a little more local, we might get the opportunity to engage with people like India, China, and like indigenous communities on a more human level, which I think could be really, really positive. And I think we've seen a little bit more of that in this COP outside of the negotiation room. We've seen a lot of really cool non-state actors from really diverse areas come up with great
On that
solutions.
point, and not taking from Francis's, the tenor of Francis's question, isn't it almost as important, if not arguably more important, to have a multiplicity, to have all voices there, all countries there, as it is to have particular leaders there, in the sense, or somebody taking a leadership position? Of course you want them there, but the notion that they would come through, because the nature of international affairs at the moment and geopolitics is such that it's not happening, and we know there are complex reasons why that's happening. There are wars, there's been an election in the state, there's an awful lot happening even outside this agenda that would seem to mitigate against there being the possibility to unite around leaders.
I'd agree with that point. I think the leader's point was interesting, because obviously von der Leyen was doing the hearings, that kind of pulled her away from it. I think she'd have been there. Otherwise, obviously what we're seeing in Germany's slowed stuff down. You made the US points better than I could. You could certainly see during those Trump years before, and I was there for a few of them, you could see the states stepping up, and it wasn't just California. You could see people from all over parts of the US. I think what is interesting, there did still feel momentum when I was there. Even if you just take China, which we don't often talk about, and obviously there's still way too much coal there, but you do see them putting on more solar in the last year than pretty much the US has ever. So you're seeing they're going hell for leather for it. And you did see, as you walked around, you saw the different nationalities. While the big fish might not have been there, a lot of the people who are actually doing some of the work were. And you've got a real sense that people were still working hard. And if maybe it's not going as well in Sinead's room, there were other people sharing how you get the grid moving quicker. There were other people talking about how you get permitting faster. So some of those perhaps lower down conversations.
And regional as well.
Correct.
Of course. Isn't that a factor as well? Jerry, do you have any thoughts on that? Or?
Yeah, a couple of different points. So I think, first of all, I think certain groups and countries have been critical of the EU, going back to the original question around the lack of either ambition or specificity on some of the climate finance targets, and particularly around this whole area of loss and damage. That could all change very rapidly as we reach final agreement, and ultimately we're not in the negotiating rooms. But I also wanted to touch upon the point around Minister Ryan's work just before we finish up. And needless to say, Friends of the Earth does an awful lot of work and communication and advocacy to parties. Not all of it, I would freely admit, supportive, but are positive, I should say. But I am struck by the level of time and commitment that Minister Ryan has given to the UNFCCC, to the COPs, and by extension, officials like Sinead. And I don't, to use an Irish expression, I'm not simply trying to plumb us here. The point is actually, as we look towards the general election, it's far from guaranteed that a future minister would necessarily either be able or be willing to dedicate that level of time to the international agenda. And that's something that we really want to see continued, including through the likes of the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance, this diplomatic initiative that has real potential to deliver positive change. And I also wanted to, moving backwards almost, I wanted to touch upon attendance at COPs and the role of the COPs.
And you can slide into that discussion now, if you like, where I stopped you earlier.
Okay, yeah. I mean, from having been there, it's obviously absolutely central. And no one is suggesting, I think, particularly from an Irish perspective, that this key multilateral process should simply be removed. But it is very much a intergovernmental negotiation mixed with one part networking and two parts corporate trade event. And that has positives. I would say it is a little bit like a festival with predominantly men in suits. The irony is not lost that I am here a man in a suit, but there are to actually the more important point is a couple of important points. Number one, where we are at climate at the moment, there are the huge risks, and we're seeing it play out. You know, particularly we've seen in the likes of Valencia, we are not going in the right direction. And on the back of that, and this is where it links into attendance, the huge degree of disillusionment there is when, whether it's individuals or NGOs or other organizations attend COP, that there often isn't that level of urgency reflected. And even more importantly, and I think, you know, you touched upon this, it is not a simple process attending COP. Men are overrepresented, lack of representation by women, and real difficulties for developing states and climate vulnerable states attending the COPs as well. Having said all of that, it is the moment of the year that all states and the media are focused on COP, so we can't get away from it. And Mary Robinson and others I know wrote an open letter recently, other leaders, on reforms to the COP, including in trying to limit the influence of perhaps states which are not supportive of this agenda. And also, and I'll finish on this, trying to, and this is not easy, but restrict the influence and attendance of fossil fuel lobbyists. And I guess there is a challenge that I don't think NGOs would want the COP necessarily to become a very limited technical exercise and opportunity for stakeholder engagement. But the level of representation by fossil fuel lobbyists is significant. There's analysis been done that I think there's about 1,700 fossil fuel lobbyists in attendance now, including several as part of the EU's delegation. And I mean, it's also, this is not an easy thing to address. I mean, it's hardly like fossil fuel lobbyists are walking around in GAA jerseys. They're part of country delegations. We have issues that grid, state gas companies are equally there. So it's not an easy process, but I think the recommendations by Mary Robinson and others offer a useful place to start.
I mean, just on that, Aaron, I mean, it's often occurred to me that, I mean, as you say, it's a tricky issue, as Jerry says, but, because of course, the other side of the argument is, what's the famous thing that, Fergus Finlay or somebody said about the negotiations here, if Sinn Féin weren't in the room, not worth a penny candle or something. So what would be the point in having a discussion that key players weren't there? And of course, these big companies are players, and the challenge may be, I just put this as a sort of devil's advocate, I mean, the challenge is not so much to find a way of excluding them, much as maybe many of us would like, but to ensure sufficiently robust states and state organizations, and the UN in particular, ultimately where agreements are made, that they give the proper weight to that kind of influence, which ought not to be a dominant one.
Yeah, this is actually a great question and a great topic. The reality is these companies, these actors have influence, and they're going to be a key part of the way society operates. So they're going to be part of these conversations on global crises and global action. However, right now, and this is a fault of a lot of developed countries and developed economies, countries are treated almost like people, or people with interests and people with power, because they have so much money and they hold so many jobs and things like that. I think there has to be a shift from this almost fear of upsetting them and their profits to prioritizing that stakeholder engagement, prioritizing people, and prioritizing sustainable jobs and sustainable engagements with companies, because the private sector has an incredible opportunity to make a huge difference if they're coming at it from the right perspective. And in my day-to-day work, I work specifically with SMEs, and I see that will with so many of them, and SMEs make up a huge contingent of our economy here in Ireland, in the United States, the UK, and globally, but they are not getting the same representation as the big conglomerate giants of the world. And I really think that they could come in with some cool solutions if we could figure out how to shift that power balance. I am not the expert in diplomacy to know exactly how to do that, but that would be a dream. And it's part of the reason why a lot of my hope with COP lies in the networking and lies in the knowledge sharing and the side events that are not necessarily in the room. I would love to get an amazing agreement that like we all feel really excited about and feel energized to act on, but it's a huge diplomatic event. I don't see that happening. Like it's just impossible. It's hard. But then when you see partnerships between organizations like SSE and other countries or other actors, and then they do something really cool and innovative, like that's where my hope and excitement comes from. And if we could shift the power from the big companies to these really cool, innovative partnerships, I think we'd really be moving in the right direction on taking the power out of the corporation's hands.
Sounds like a nice cue for us to finish with Sam, which I will. But I took my eye off the audience. Was there any other final, not necessarily a question, because we won't have time really for too many answers, but we can certainly have an observation. Yeah, that man over there.
Thanks. I'm curious where methane has gone in the conversation. There was a very hard-fought global methane pledge a few years ago. I mean, it's kind of commonly accepted now, finally, that it's responsible for around 30%, a third of global warming. It's 80 times more global warming potential over a 20-year time horizon. Feels like it could be a cornerstone to decarbonize, especially for developed economies like Ireland, in a way that's in compliance with our nationally determined contributions. So how could we maybe keep that a bit more central?
Sure, I'll take that as a sort of as a statement, or as a cri de coeur, as you know, that we should be doing it. And in fact, we're doing some work, a lot of work in the institute now. We have a project going on agriculture, on the impact of climate on agriculture and agriculture trade in particular in Ireland. So very conscious of that. And thank you for the point. Is there anybody else would just like to say something briefly before I go to Sam for a final word? And I don't think that there is. And thank you again, Sam, for the SSE, for your support for this event, and thanks for your participation. But I'll thank all the panelists at the end. Would you like to have a last word?
Yeah, just last word on that COP process, because I thought the letter, the Mary Robinson letter, was very, very interesting. Because you can, I think it said was, you've delivered a lot through COPs. I know 29. I don't forget to COP 60, we're in problems. But from COP 29. If you look back, you've created these carbon budget that countries have put forward. You had moments like the deforestation commitment in the Glasgow. These are valuable things, such as the funding one we've got now. And my one worry is, while I want to get the process more focused on delivery, because I think the age of targets is over and it's now about delivery and measurement, really enforcing that through and having a robust process around that. I don't want it to end up in so much in a navel gazing process where we talk about the process and don't actually prioritize action, because there's a period where we need pace over perfection. So I sort of hope that debate resolves itself quite quickly in a way that drives more action and pace, and that we don't just go on some governance roadshow for a long time.
Very good. Well, you've left it on a positive note, reasonably, relatively speaking. So thank you very much, Sam Peacock, SSE, Erin Marr of ENSO, Jerry McEvely of Friends of the Earth. Earlier, Sinead Walsh, Dr. Sinead Walsh, Climate Director in the Department of Foreign Affairs. I think it's been a very interesting discussion. We haven't been poring over the outcome of COP29 because we don't know it yet, but we're all left in, I think, with a reasonable level of optimism, I think, that the weekend will come to some form of agreement and lay the groundwork, as Sam and others have been saying, for Brazil next year. Thanks everybody for your attendance. As always, great to have you here. Thank you for attending online if you did. We'll see you all soon.
This podcast is brought to you by the IIEA, sharing ideas, shaping policy.